Hello, everyone. This is Bridget Burns, and I'm hoping that you can hear me. Everyone at the moment is on listen-only mode, but I'm going to unmute everyone for a minute, if I can do that, just to make sure that everyone can hear me. Doesn't seem to allow me to unmute right away, or maybe I just need to. Lista, I wonder, I was able to unmute you. Are you able to hear me? Or Joanna?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, Joanna. And can you hear and can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for helping me out with that. Okay, so I'm going to just give 1 or 2 minutes for a few other people to come on. And I am recording this, and it will be made available afterwards. The purpose of this first session is really a very basic background of the UNFCCC process, as well as a brief overview of some of the key agenda items that are going to be discussed at the upcoming session. I have a pretty detailed slide presentation that I've also shared as a PDF in one of the handouts. I won't go through every single agenda item in detail because I think that it would take too much time to explain each piece, but I'm going to show you where you can go to get a bit more background on all of these different agenda items. So I'm just going to give it 1 more minute and then we will kick off. Okay, so I'm going to get started now. The intention is to go through this presentation in no more than 20 or 30 minutes, and then allow for any questions that people might have or any follow-up that there might be. If you have questions throughout the time of the call, there is a questions button, and feel free to send it in there. Or you can also, as an attendee, raise your hand. So please feel free to use that function and raise your hand as well. I'll do my best to make sure that I see everyone. If I don't see people right away, then I will definitely come back to you at the end. So I'm just going to start with a bit of convention basics. Well, maybe just to give a bit of background on myself first. As mentioned, I am the co-director of the Women's Environment Development Organization, WEDO, which is based in New York. And for, I think, 2 years now, I've been the acting co-focal point of the Women and Gender constituency at the UNFCCC. And I myself have been following the UN climate negotiation process for several years. And we've been running, as an organization, trainings on the convention and on the negotiated process for about 7 years, getting people familiar with the basics and also with the meeting process itself. So some of this might be background that you all are very well aware of, and hopefully this can just live on as a tool for those who are coming to this process for the first time. So the convention, of course, entered into force on March 21st in 1994, and it has now near universal membership. The 197 countries that have ratified the convention are called the parties to the convention. And the basic premise of the entire UNFCCC is preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. And we talk a lot about what was important and critical in 1994 when this entered into force, and the premise behind the convention. It recognized that there was a problem, which was quite significant at the time, even though there had been tons of research and scientific knowledge around it. Having this convention come forward was critical to being able to take forward next steps. It does set a lofty but specific goal. We often talk about the goal set in the Paris Agreement, but there is a goal that is clear in the convention itself, and it's really important to recognize that all parties to the convention are expected to meet that goal. It's set from the beginning an understanding of that climate action puts the onus on developed countries to lead the way, and also establishes a path forward for directing new funds to climate change activities in developing countries. So I'll show you a little bit later as well, but it's really important to know that this is embedded in the principles of the convention, this differentiation and the responsibility and leadership of developed countries. It keeps tabs on the problem and what's being done about it. It charts the beginnings of a path to strike a delicate balance, and that is when we discuss this, and this is partly how the convention is discussed on the UNFCCC website and by the Secretariat, this balance between how do you continue to develop, perhaps in a non-sustainable way or an unsustainable way, how do certain countries continue to grow, and how do you mitigate at the same time. So it starts to look at that challenge, and then it kicks off formal consideration of adaptation to climate change. So what is this goal that is clearly articulated in the convention itself? It's to achieve the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And then it defines that level by saying such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So it gives some pretty clear parameters about what needs to be met, or what is the tipping point, essentially, where we have moved beyond a sufficient time frame for allowing ecosystems to adapt naturally. It doesn't give a temperature goal in this scenario, but it does outline some of the key parameters, and this is partly what the IPCC, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been studying for many years to really help assess when and if we've reached that tipping. One thing to note about the goal of 2 degrees Celsius, which is enshrined now in the Paris Agreement, with the goal of actually keeping warming under 1.5 degrees. And again, it's, there's a challenge, of course, because we do see this warming happening, and it's not that we're trying to get towards a goal of a certain degree, it's really keeping temperatures well below. At 2 degrees itself, we can afford, it's the highest rise we can afford if we want just a 50% chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. So it's important to remember, and this is why, for example, small island developing states pushed so incredibly hard to have that recognition of keeping warming under 1.5 degrees, because we're already seeing disastrous impacts at less than that. Before the Industrial Revolution, concentrations of carbon dioxide were fairly stable at 280 parts per million, but this has gone up 41% from then until now. So of course this really highlights the challenge that we have and the scale to which it is a current problem, and it's something that has been really accelerated in our lifetimes. As I mentioned before, so we had Article 2 of the Convention, which enshrined the goal of keeping warming below a dangerous level. And again, all parties who are parties to the convention are expected to work and to take actions towards that goal. Another key element is this understanding of common but differentiated responsibilities. So UNFCCC parties should act to protect the climate system on the basis of equality and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So this principle has two fundamental elements. The first is the common part, the common responsibility of parties to protect the environment or parts of it at the national, regional, and global levels. So this is a really important understanding that common but differentiated responsibilities is not alleviating responsibility from any party to protect the environment. This is enshrined in the convention. But the second part is that there is a need to take into account the different circumstances, particularly each party's contribution to the problem and its abilities to prevent, reduce, and control the threat. As we're working in the context of the Paris Agreement now, it's really important that these principles remain very strongly part of the discussion we have on the UNFCCC, that we consistently remind parties of the goal that they have towards keeping warming below a dangerous level, and the goal that they have to take common but differentiated responsibility. So how do we go from the goals of the convention to a process that actually helps us to enforce those goals? It's important to note that the treaty, as originally framed, sets out the framework, the pathway, and the goals, but it doesn't set any mandatory limits itself on greenhouse gases, whether they're for individual nations. It didn't contain any enforcement provisions. The treaty included provisions for updates or protocols that would then set the mandatory emission limits. So the principal update that many of you are probably familiar with is the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement is now has now entered into force, and it frames these commitments or contributions of parties, this time based on their nationally determined contributions. So we can discuss the difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And I won't go through this in too much detail. Again, all of this presentation is here for you to review. But I think it's helpful to understand, in particular, to see where we are in this process and whether or not we're in line with or behind the pace that these processes normally take. The timeline of adoption of the UNFCCC comes from a number of years of growing public concern over environmental issues, with the first World Climate Conference taking place in 1979, and really a huge effort to link this scientific evidence throughout the 80s, including with the setup of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, and then their first report, which stated that human-induced climate change is indeed a threat, and actually called for the global treaty to address the problem. So the 1990s, many of you are aware, was a really big time for global conventions, particularly around the environment, and the resolution 45-212 of UNGA, the UN General Assembly, called for a framework convention to be drafted by what was then an intergovernmental negotiating committee for developing this framework convention. I did mention in here, because I think it's important to note that women's groups have been engaged in this conversation since the very beginning and have been very aware and advocating on the need for increasing climate action. In November, in November 1991, WEDO and its partners around the world developed the Women's Action Agenda 21, and in that called specifically for world leaders to sign the Global Climate Change Convention and to commit to a 20% reduction of carbon dioxide by the year 2000. After 5 negotiating sessions between 91 and 92, in 1992, the Framework Convention was open for signature, and it entered then into force 2 years later in 1994, with the first COP taking place in 1995. From 1995 until 1997, there were a number of negotiations that took place, and in 1997 you saw the adoption of that first update So the first regulatory framework to set binding obligations on industrialized countries to reduce emissions to greenhouse gases. It's important to note that similar to the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol adoption in 1997 set out the goal of those binding obligations, but it took until 2001 for the rules to be adopted. So similar to where we are in the Paris Agreement, where we have not yet established the rules for the Paris Agreement, this is the timeline the Kyoto Protocol took. And the Kyoto Protocol then did not enter into force until 2005. So 1997 adopted, 2001 the rules are adopted, and then 2005 it entered into force. And you have the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol ranging from 2008 into 2012. And then you also had a follow-up second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And of course, the challenge with the KP itself was that the United States, although signing on to the adoption, did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And so you had a set of rules for developed countries, industrialized countries, which did not include one of the largest emitters. And there was a keen understanding there would need to be further updates and further protocols. But also, I think what's important to note is a real shift in the discussions on under the convention, with an understanding that this could not be a technical convention, that you could not solve the issue of climate change by looking for a science or a technological fix, because we have so deeply embedded, particularly in a fossil fuel-based economy, and the shift to do that in our energy transport, agriculture, food production systems requires much more thought, process, and social engagement, but also that the process is slow and ongoing, and that the impacts of climate change were already being felt, so there needed to be more focus and attention on adaptation, for example. And so in 2007, in Bali, there was a launch of what was called the Bali Action Plan, and it set up this ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action with an understanding that parties were working towards a new global agreement set to be adopted at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. And what's really important about the Bali Action Plan is it laid out the framework for which we understand the negotiations to undertake today. It laid out that they wanted an agreement which would create a shared vision, but also look at mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer and development, and capacity building. And there were several negotiation sessions held between 2007 and 2009, aiming towards this global goal, this global agreement. And of course, Copenhagen failed to achieve that globally adopted agreement. It instead produced a Copenhagen Accord, which was voluntary, included voluntary pledges of an annual $100 billion per year on climate action. So this is where the climate finance commitment actually comes from. But it did not get us to what we got to finally in the Paris Agreement. And so you saw a process from that point on where, not wanting to lose the work that had been put into the negotiations towards Copenhagen, several decisions were taken between 2010 and 2011 to set up new bodies, including the Adaptation Committee, the Technology Executive Committee, the Green Climate Fund, with the intention of pushing forward work on technology, adaptation, and finance that had hoped to be part of the global agreement. And after taking those decisions, it was decided that that original working group that had been set up to define the agreement in Copenhagen would be ended. It was ended in Durban, and a new timeline was laid out for the global agreement with legal force to be adopted in 2015 and enforced in 2020. And of course, the Paris Agreement, as you all know, was adopted in 2015. The big difference amongst this whole timeline here is that the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016, 4 years earlier than anticipated or expected, as the sign of a very strong political will towards its enforcement. And this has a number of implications in terms of the agenda, which we'll look at next. I'm just going to check and make sure there's no hands raised or questions. Okay, great. I am not going to go through this slide in too much detail. I wanted to let everyone know that this is available on the website as a table of trying to understand the different bodies of the convention, how they meet and how they work. It is a very complex convention itself. It's a very complex issue, and one thing to really note, especially if this is your first time engaging in the process, is that although there is a lot of space, particularly in side events and in kind of larger discussions where you're talking about the really tangible climate impacts and effects and how to create change, the nitty-gritty of the negotiations themselves often are very process-oriented, and they're often really focused on how do you set up the registries, the bodies, the consultation mechanisms, the facilitatory mechanisms to help parties achieve the goals that they have created for themselves under this convention. The Conference of the Parties, there's sort of three overarching bodies, of course, that relate to those different aspects that I just discussed. Those, the UNFCCC convention itself and the parties that are signed up to that convention make up the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, which is the ultimate body, of course. Then you have what's called the CMP, or the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So when we go through the agenda, you'll see that the COP has a specific agenda, the CMP has a specific agenda, and then the CMA, which is the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. The CMA will also have a specific agenda. And there might be agenda items where the COP or the CMP or the CMA will deal with that agenda item directly. More likely, though, a number of those agenda items are going to be forwarded to the permanent subsidiary bodies. And this is really where most of the work under the UNFCCC happens. So you have the subsidiary body for implementation, which deals with a lot of the setting up tools and setting up guidelines and processes for the actual implementation of agreements, of the aspects of the agreements, whether they're related to adaptation, gender issues you find under the SBI, for example. And we'll go through a little bit what's on the agenda under that. And then you have the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SUBSTA. And the SUBSTA is how it sounds. It's really a body where parties are discussing the methodologies, tools, and research that are needed to enhance and support the goals of the convention. And sometimes you have items that clearly belong to both of those subsidiary bodies, so they might be considered as a joint agenda item of both the SUBSTA and the SBI. In addition to those bodies, you have a set of convention bodies as well as Kyoto Protocol bodies that deal with everything from adaptation to the mechanisms that are set up. And again, I won't go through them in detail, but for example, you have the Adaptation Committee, a Standing Committee on Finance, which is really reviewing, and this is where, for example, it can become a bit difficult. If you want to follow climate finance, what you need to understand about the architecture of climate finance is that the convention itself has a financial mechanism which consists of two funds, the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, and the Green Climate Fund. And within that, the GEF, which is one of the main funds originally set up, also manages two other special funds, which is the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developed Country Fund. You also have, under the Kyoto Protocol, the Adaptation Fund, and that's where you see, for example, this Adaptation Fund Board, which then controls the Adaptation Fund. And one of the big discussions under the that'll be happening at the upcoming COP is whether that adaptation fund will also serve the Paris Agreement, because right now it's set to serve the Kyoto Protocol. There's a technology mechanism which consists of the executive committee as well as the advisory board on the Climate Technology Center network. One important difference between those is the tech is really an oversight body which is reviewing the technology needs assessments of countries, which is making recommendations back to the COP itself. The advisory board advises the CTCN itself, and it meets and discusses work. But the CTCN as a network is an open network that organizations can join, and it's supposed to be a facilitatory network, a facilitated network between countries and civil society or other multilateral agencies that can meet the needs that the countries have. So that's a recommendation for any of you who are interested, particularly in technology transfer and development. You may want to look at this committee, or sorry, the CTCN, and see how you can get engaged. I'm going to leave this for now. Again, understanding the process can be challenging, and you'll see the different agenda items on each of these different committees, and so sometimes it's really just going through the background, seeing how they were set up and what their purpose is. So just quickly on the 2015 Paris outcomes, this is just an overview of what was actually, in terms of documentation, what actually came out of Paris. You had the Paris Agreement itself, which as shown above is subsidiary to the convention. It was a treaty subject to ratification, and the decision itself included, or the agreement I should say, included a purpose section, and the purpose section was actually one that the women and gender constituency engaged in quite heavily. We had, unfortunately, as you'll see, as listed here, the purpose and/or the preamble. We really focused on trying to integrate gender equality language and human rights language across the substance of the text, which is really the operational piece of the text. But where we do have a very strong language is in the purpose or preamble section, which includes language on gender equality, women's empowerment, human rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, just transition and decent work. And so a lot of the work we're doing now in advocacy under the Paris Agreement rule book, or the setting up of the implementation guidelines, is trying to link back to that preamble. You also then, of course, have this substantive section, which includes sections on mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, technology transfer, and capacity building. And then you have a whole set of institutional arrangements. So that's the rest of the agreement, which is about setting up, for example, the CMA, or the Conference of the Meeting of the Parties of the Paris Agreement, how the Secretariat will function, and how the subsidiary bodies will or will not serve the Paris Agreement. And then there was a decision, CP21, that actually adopted the Paris Agreement. It set up the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. So you'll hear a lot about the APA. The APA is essentially that process that is setting up the rules for the Paris Agreement. It's a little bit more complicated now because the CMA, because of the entry into force, is also happening in parallel, but things have already been decided on how that would work. And the Decision 1 CP21 also includes an enhanced action prior to 2020. So just a few things on the current status of the Paris Agreement. The UN Secretary General serves as the depository of the Paris Agreement. There was an official signing ceremony held at the UN headquarters on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2016, with 175 signing and 15 depositing instruments of ratification on that day. And I think the majority of those who did it on that day were small and developing states. The SIDS countries had a huge impact in influence in the Paris Agreement and signing the Paris Agreement, and also in showing and calling for political will and its ratification. So to date, you've had, I think these need to be a little bit updated, but you've had the 55 parties covering 55% of GHG emissions. It was met on October 5th, 2016, and the Paris Agreement entered into force on the 4th of November. 195 of 197 states have signed the Paris Agreement. 166 parties have deposited instruments of ratification representing nearly 85% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we note that the USA announced its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on the 1st of June in 2017. And so just a couple of notes on that. If in terms of the actual ratification and the 85%, even with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement, that concentration of global greenhouse gas emissions needed to be in force will still be met. So it's one thing. And then the other piece on the intention to withdraw is that within the Paris Agreement itself, parties have to wait, all parties to the agreement have to wait at least 3 years before being able to state or to put forward that their request to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So even though the US has announced its intention to withdraw, it cannot officially start the withdrawal process until 3 years from the start of, from its entry into force. So November 4th, 2019. And then even after that, it takes a full year until that country or party is considered outside of the agreement. And so the earliest that the US will be officially outside of the Paris Agreement is November 4th, 2020, likely a day or 3 before another US election. So it's a very interesting timeline. And what it also means is that the US will be is a party to the Paris Agreement, and will be able to be part of the APA discussions and have a voice or a seat at the table. Politically, there's obviously lots of different considerations to be made there, but I've had a lot of those questions, so that's just to help with the understanding of that. I'm not going to go too much into detail on this. There were a lot of decisions made on how to have the APA ongoing, figuring out the rules of the Paris Agreement while also having the CMA convene and suspend and come back again. One thing that is important to note is that you'll see in the agendas of the different meetings, the different bodies that are meeting, that it's CMA 1.2 or 1.3. That's because the CMA has set an agenda and it is not adjourning, it is just suspending and reconvening, so it's the same agenda that's being followed each time. And then the APA has made a decision that it will intend to adopt decisions at COP24 next year. So there's a lot of pressure on the current COP23 presidency to make significant progress under the APA, under each of the different agenda items of the APA, moving into 2018. And I would expect that there will be a ramp up of potentially of meetings. I've already heard it being called that there will be extra meetings next year in order to make sure that the decisions on the rules of the Paris Agreement will actually be adopted in 2018. So politically, some of the ways that at least we talk about the political goals or the political outcomes of the Paris Agreement, of course, the importance of having a goal to keep warming under 1.5 degrees. The actual language is keeping warming under 2 degrees with a goal of 1.5 degrees. And having that recognition was critical and important, and it's definitely something that was called for by many developing and small island states. You do have a strong set, well, a set of country NDCs, not necessarily strong, but you have countries that have put forward contributions that it gives the world something to benchmark or to review or to go back on. Many have called it the symbolic end to the fossil fuel era politically, because if you can consistently say that if parties want to meet the goals that they've set themselves in the Paris Agreement, it has to be. You saw gender and human rights mainstreamed into the Paris Agreement in relation to adaptation, capacity building, as well as in the preamble, along with language on human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples. Other aspects, however, of the Paris outcomes, of course, is that the current policies in place are nowhere near, the current contributions, I should say, in place are nowhere near what we need to be to actually meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The current policies deliver a 3.6 at this point in terms of the review of it, median warming by 2100. If the NDCs were fully implemented now, which many of them are nowhere near being, we will still reach a higher temperature of warming than we've pledged to keep ourselves under. The policies, as said, lag well behind the NDC pledges. We have a small window of opportunity to turn it around. And one of the other critical challenges is that there's not real clarity on climate finance flows, where it counts and what it will come from, and where it will come from. And I mentioned here a clear and safe pathway to achieving the goal of staying below 1.5 degrees. This is a really key message right now and a key focus area of the women and gender constituency, because we're highly concerned that although we have this agreement of staying below 1.5 degrees, we saw language throughout on socially and environmentally sound technology, and looking at a pathway towards staying below 1.5 degrees. We're not sure or clear that that will be done in a just manner. And so this could include, for example, large-scale technology fixes, geoengineering, etc., technologies that we're highly concerned about, really, really large-scale bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And so this is an area where I think that a lot of the conversations we're also having are to showcase and highlight from our perspective, from a feminist perspective and a women's rights perspective, what this transition looks like, how it can be just, how it can be safe, and how we can achieve keeping warming well below 1.5 degrees through our solutions. And so this is a lot of the influence behind the work that's being done by the constituency on promoting gender-just climate solutions. So I'm just going to go. Just so people have a sense, if this is their first process of the typical negotiating session, you usually have around 16,000 participants representing parties alone. This was the number that you had in Marrakesh. You often have around 1,200 media representatives, and then around 5,000 or so representatives of observer organizations. So overall, it's a very large space, about 20,000 people or so who actually attend the whole entire COP. I'm not going to go through all of these pieces, but I did just want to, I have about 5 more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes of presentation. I did just want to quickly highlight to you what's in these slides about the meeting process itself. Although it doesn't feel like this, especially at a COP, because there's so much chaos happening and there's so many side events in different spaces, and I will show you where on the website you can find some of this information. There is a very specific process that each of the different agenda items will take. They will all start with an opening plenary. Whether it's the CMP, the CMA, the APA, the SBI, the SEPSTA, they will include opening remarks from usually groups of parties that are welcomed. There will be a proposal and adoption of the agenda that's been put forward. There's usually a number of agenda items that don't need to meet in informals because they're easy issues, so they will be resolved in that opening plenary. And then the difficult or complex issues will be referred to a smaller group. And that smaller group could be the SBI, for example, or the SEPSTA. As I said here, they may be established or newly established. Interested parties are usually invited, but all parties are always open. And in those smaller groups like the SBI, the SEPSTA, or if you're in the SBI or the SEPSTA, you'll be asked, for example, to go into an informal or a spin-off group, and you'll use that space to develop draft text. Or parties will use that space to develop draft text. And these are some of the examples of these smaller groups that I mentioned. It really depends on what group it starts in, the subject matter that we're talking about. And then each session or each agenda item will also have a closing plenary. And you'll have the reports from those subsidiary groups. So in the closing plenary, for example, on the COP, you have gender and climate change is an agenda item of the COP. It's a standing agenda item of the COP. However, the work on gender and climate change happens under the SBI. So in the opening plenary of the COP, you'll see gender and climate change mentioned as an agenda item. In the opening plenary of the SBI, you'll also have it mentioned there. And the SBI will likely then ask parties to host informal negotiations in either open or closed. The gender negotiations are typically open. And the first contact group of each one, so each agenda item will have a first contact group, and that contact group has typically always been open to observers, and usually the first and last informals, depending on the agenda item, are also open to observers. And one thing just to mention on that piece, if you are an advocate, you have an observer and not a party badge, and you are hoping to follow an agenda item that appears closed, it is always worth asking a party to ask the chair, if it hasn't already been deemed closed or requested by a party for the conversations to stay closed, a chair can ask parties if they are okay with it being open to observers. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, each agenda item will have these closing plenaries where you'll either just get statements of what happened. If parties are not able to come to agreement, you'll have a report back on what happened. You might have a set of recommendations or conclusions, or you might come out with a decision. Some of the typical timetables are 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. You have group coalition coordination meetings. The Women and Gender constituency, for example, has an 8 a.m. strategy meeting, which we follow up then at 9 a.m. with an open women's caucus. But at the same time, parties and groups of parties are meeting, UN regional groups are meeting, and from 10 to 1, you have the official UN meeting time. So this is officially when the different bodies are aimed to meet. From 1 to 3 is supposed to be official lunchtime, if you will, but it's not lunchtime. It's side events, informal discussions, group coordination, press conferences. We often, as a constituency, try to have meetings around that time too. From 3 to 6, you go back into official UN meeting time. There is a very formal 6 o'clock rule where no official meetings are supposed to happen after 6 o'clock. And for any session, regardless what it is, if they'd like to stay longer than 6 o'clock, they have to get official approval from the Bureau of the COP itself. And this can often have a huge impact on translation services, etc. Often, of course, we know that meetings go well beyond 6 o'clock, but there is an official rule. And an understanding that more time doesn't necessarily equal better outcomes for the process. And from 6 until 10, you have more side events and formal discussions that happen. And then this is just an overview of the negotiating blocks and groups that you'll find in the process. On your left side, these are the different negotiating blocks that are made up, that developing countries are part of. And then on the right-hand side, it's the groups that developed or kind of middle-income countries are part of. They include the Umbrella Group, the European Union, and then what's called the Environmental Integrity Group, which is sort of a group of countries that don't really fit in any of the other groups. And so you'll see in some of our advocacy meetings that we often talk about, we do advocacy with particular parties, but it's always important to find the coordinators of these different groups, because for most developing countries, they will be speaking as a group and being represented by coordinators on different issues. So it's important to know who the chairs are and of each of these different groups. And I actually have a listing of that, which I can make available to everyone. So I'm not, because of time, I'm not going to go through these meeting agendas in detail. I just wanted to let you know that this slide is here for you to use and go through if you'd like some more information on the different meeting agendas. As said, the COP is a really complex, this isn't even going through the tons of other side events and gender events that are going to be happening at the COP23. There are 6 different agendas running simultaneously at the COP. The COP23, the CMP, the CMA, all of these acronyms, which I'm sure you know and love dearly. And again, this is just shows you how the different agenda items for each one are set up, and you can use this to sort of give yourself a better understanding. For example, under the SEPSTA, you have issues related to agriculture. There's a really important agenda item on a new platform on local communities and indigenous peoples, which will be discussed. Matters related to Article 6 is a really important area because they're talking about the new Sustainable Development Mechanism that's supposed to be set up under the Paris Agreement. And this is something, as a constituency, very concerned about market-based mechanisms and approaches that we follow closely often. These are the issues being taken up under the APA. So basically, all of the issues being to formulate the rule book of the Paris Agreement. And I'm not going to go through this, but you'll see here in each agenda item, there's a clear understanding of what's going to be taken, what has been asked of parties. There's so many submissions under the APA right now that you can find online, and it tells you what else they're going to be looking at and what kind of events are happening under the APA. The last thing I wanted to mention before just showing you two other things and then opening up for questions. So as I said, you have this PowerPoint. One of the key outcomes for the Fiji presidency is to have a strong and a clear guidance on the facilitative dialogue. That you'll hear the facilitative dialogue talked about a lot. It's really sort of a precursor, or let's say a pilot of the global stock take, which will happen in 2023. And the facilitative dialogue is supposed to be the first instance of stock taking. And the discussions that we'll be having and deciding on at COP23 are about what information should be included in that facilitative dialogue and how it should be included in that facilitative dialogue and how the facilitative dialogue should be run. This is a critically important junction for developing countries in particular, because of that scary evidence that we've shown that NDCs are not in the correct place, and this understanding with the Paris Agreement that people accepted where we were with the Paris Agreement because there would be some form of ambition mechanism, because the commitments and the contributions put forward by parties could not regress. They could only be progressively instituted, so they could only go higher and be more ambitious. And also this understanding that they would be ratcheted up consistently and that they would be reviewed. And so this will be a really important moment to showcase, okay, if we are not on track, which we are not, what are we actually going to be doing to ratchet up ambition? So you'll hear a lot of discussion about that, and it is an important outcome for the COP presidency. The last thing I just wanted to quickly share with you, I hope you can see my my screen still, because now I'm showing you yes, now I'm showing you where on the website. So if you are on the UNFCCC website, from the front page and you click on agendas and annotations, for example, if you click on SBI 47, I think one of the most important documents to keep in mind is the provisional annotated agenda. As said, I only showed a few agenda items. This annotated agenda will go through each agenda item and give you a background on what has happened under this agenda item before. So this is an example of one of the agendas. What has happened, what action is expected to be taking place under at this current COP. And a document that will be shared with you shortly that WEDO usually produces is by taking that annotated agenda and then looking at the gender entry points in each agenda item. So we'll discuss this document at the strategy session we'll have this Sunday beforehand, but it's also something, if you know you're coming and you'd like to follow adaptation or finance, it's really important to study those areas where you might be able to, there might be a clear entry point for integrating the issue that you're working on in it. Tomorrow, when the second half of this session, we're going to go much more deep into the gender agenda item itself, as well as have a review of the key demands of the women and gender constituency in relation to some of these key items that are coming up. So that's what I have to share for now, and I'm just wondering if there are any questions or comments. I apologize, I see there is a question and can't read it for now. I see, Kara. So your question is around women's participation in the negotiations. I have all of that information to share tomorrow in my slides. So hopefully you will be able to join then. Fantastic. Are there any other hands raised or questions? I'm just seeing. That was the only question I saw. Are there any comments that other people who are on? I see a lot of I see a lot of UNFCCC and gender experts on the call. Vosita and Anne and Usha. Is there anything that you would like to add? Hannah, I think you added a question. Yes, the presentation that was just given, it's been recorded and I will put it on YouTube as soon as I can. And Ida, I think you have a question too, but I have not. Oh, you just said thank you. Okay, great. Great. So as I said, tomorrow we'll go much more in depth. I know that there's a lot of questions on what is happening on gender, and so the intention tomorrow is to really go quickly through the history of gender in this process, what's happening on the gender action plan. I'll include the information on the current status of women's participation, and then just a little bit on our key demands and some of the key gender events you should know about. And if there's anything else after these two sessions that we haven't covered, I'm going to send an evaluation out so we can make sure we cover it in our strategy session prior to COP23. Asha, I think, will the audio be there? Yes, the audio will be there as well. So this entire presentation and webinar will be shared on YouTube. And the session tomorrow will also be put on YouTube as well. Perfect. I think that is all the questions. Aiska, I have in the hand, there's apologies because I think your screen might look different to me, different than mine, but there should be a handout. There's one handout and it's the PDF of the presentation I just shared. And you should be able to download it. Is anyone else able to do that? Okay, great. Perfect. So perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really glad we stayed within the time, and there doesn't seem to be any other questions. So hopefully I'll see some of you tomorrow, and if you can't make it tomorrow, don't worry, because we will put these on YouTube and make them available for you to watch and listen to me talk every day, because I know you want to. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.